The estate stood like a modern-day fortress, a monolithic structure of glass and stone perched atop the rolling hills of Los Angeles. It wasn't just a house. It was a kingdom, a realm of quiet dominance stretching across 3.5 acres of prime California land. Behind its imposing gates lay a world of unimaginable luxury. Private bowling alleys, subterranean garages filled with gleaming supercars, and infinity pools reflecting the city's endless lights. It had taken years to build. Every detail, from the Italian marble floors to the hand-carved wooden panels in the grand hall, had been personally overseen by Tony Pritzker, a billionaire heir to one of America's most powerful business dynasties. He wasn't just rich. He was Pritzker rich, a name that carried weight in boardrooms and whispered conversations among the elite. Beside him, for over 3 decades, stood Jeanne, the woman who had once been the love of his life. She wasn't a quiet figure in the background. She was a force of nature in her own right, a philanthropist, an advocate for foster children, a woman who moved through the same exclusive circles yet never seemed to be fully absorbed by them. For years, their life had appeared perfect from the outside. The charity galas, the lavish vacations, the carefully curated media appearances, it all painted a picture of unity, of power, of a couple who had built an empire together. But inside that grand estate, the air was different. The silence between them had stretched too long. Conversations turned into brief exchanges, then into hollow formalities. The laughter that once filled the halls had long since faded. Beneath the surface of their luxurious life, cracks had formed, growing wider with each passing year. And now those cracks were about to rupture into something far more destructive. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jeanne stood on the balcony of the master suite, looking out over the sprawling city below. The lights twinkled like a million distant lives, each one moving forward, unaware of the storm about to break in this house on the hill. Behind her, footsteps. Tony's voice was calm, but carried an edge. "We need to talk." It was the beginning of something that would shake their world and everyone watching it. Jeanne turned to face Tony, her expression unreadable. For years, she had known this moment would come, but now that it had arrived, it still felt like a slow-motion car crash, inevitable, yet impossible to fully prepare for. Tony stood at the threshold of their bedroom, his face set like stone. Even in his casual attire, he carried himself with the weight of a man used to being in control. But in this moment, control was slipping through his fingers. "I'm selling the house," he said, his voice level. Jeanne barely reacted. "No, you're not," she replied, turning back toward the city view. Tony exhaled, a mix of frustration and resignation. He had anticipated her resistance. "The trust owns it," he said, stepping closer. "You and I both know that." Jeanne finally turned to face him, her eyes locking onto his with a quiet intensity. "That's a technicality," she said. "You built this house for us, for our family, for everything we've built together." Tony ran a hand through his salt and pepper hair. "We're past that, Jan. The house is an asset, and I need to liquidate assets." Jane let out a humorless laugh. "That's what this is to you? An asset?" Tony didn't answer. She took a step forward. "This house is more than just bricks and glass. It's a place where I've hosted fundraisers for causes that actually matter. It's a place where I've built something meaningful, something beyond just money." Tony's jaw tightened. He had heard this argument before. "You can find another venue for your charities," he said. "This house was never meant to be a forever home." Jeanne shook her head. "It was for me." The silence that followed was thick. It carried years of unspoken words, of compromises that had only delayed the inevitable. Then Jeanne's voice dropped to a whisper. "This isn't just about the house, is it?" Tony hesitated. Then finally he answered. "No," he admitted. John swallowed hard. There it was. The truth. This wasn't just about a mansion in the hills or a high-profile divorce. It was about something deeper. Power, legacy, the tangled mess of love and resentment that had been building for years. It was about what happens when a billionaire and his wife stop being partners and become opponents. And now the fight was about to begin. The next morning, the estate was eerily quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet that came with sunrise over the Los Angeles hills, but the tense, suffocating quiet before a storm. Jean sat in the grand dining room, staring at the untouched cup of coffee in front of her. Across the long mahogany table, her attorney, Linda Carlisle, flipped through a thick folder of legal documents. Linda had been through high-profile divorces before. She had seen billionaires and celebrities claw at each other over mansions, jets, and businesses. But the Pritzkers, this was different. This wasn't just about money. It was about power. "So let me get this straight," Linda said, adjusting her glasses. "The house isn't in your name. It's in a trust." Jan nodded, arms crossed. Linda exhaled. "That's not good." Jane's voice was firm. "Tony built this house. I lived in it for over a decade. My children grew up here. And more importantly, I need this house for my philanthropy work." Linda tapped her pen against the table, thinking, "Even if you lived here, if your name isn't on the ownership documents, legally, you don't own it." Jen clenched her jaw. "So what? I just walk away while Tony sells it to the highest bidder?" Linda sighed. But this is going to be a battle." Jane looked out the window at the massive estate, the sprawling gardens, the infinity pool glistening in the morning light. This wasn't just a home. It was a symbol, and Tony knew it. She turned back to Linda. "I don't care how long it takes. We fight." Tony sat in his private office in Century City, the skyline of Los Angeles stretching beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. His attorney, Mark Edelson, paced the room, briefing him on the latest developments. "She's going to fight this," Mark said. Tony didn't look up from his desk. "Of course she is." "She's hired Linda Carlisle," Mark added. That made Tony glance up. He knew the name. Linda was aggressive, relentless, one of the top divorce lawyers in the country. "She doesn't have a legal claim," Tony said, leaning back in his chair. "The trust owns the house. End of story." Mark exhaled. "That's the legal story. The real story is that Jean's going to turn this into a media circus." Tony's fingers drummed against his desk. He had spent his life keeping a low profile, handling his wealth discreetly, unlike some of the other billionaires who flaunted their fortunes. A public battle over this house? That wasn't the kind of attention he wanted. Mark continued. If she plays the sympathetic ex-wife fighting for her charitable work card, this could get ugly. Tony closed his eyes for a moment. He had built this empire on calculated moves. He wasn't about to let emotions derail everything. "Then we shut it down before it starts," he said. "Find a way." Mark nodded, already planning next steps. The war had begun. The morning headlines confirmed what Tony had feared. Billionaire divorce battle over $200 million mansion turns ugly. Gene Pritzker fights to keep the family estate for philanthropy, while Tony Pritzker pushes for a sale. The bitter divorce of the Hyatt heir exposes the secretive financial structures of the ultra-rich. Tony sat in his office, scrolling through article after article. Some were neutral, merely reporting the facts. Others painted him as the villain, the cold-hearted billionaire trying to take a home from his ex-wife, a woman dedicated to charity. He threw his phone onto the desk and leaned back in his chair. Damn it. Mark Edelson, his attorney, looked unfazed. I told you she'd go public. Tony sighed. I underestimated how fast she'd move. Mark nodded. Jean knows exactly what she's doing. She's making this about more than just the divorce. She's making it about legacy. Tony exhaled sharply. And I'm the villain. Mark shrugged. You're a billionaire in a public divorce. That automatically makes you the villain. Tony clenched his jaw. Then we fight back. Mark slid a folder across the desk. Already ahead of you. We dig into the trust structure, make it airtight. We make sure the legal battle drags on long enough that she either backs down or runs out of leverage. Tony nodded. Do it. Jean sat in the living room, her legs curled up on the plush white sofa, her laptop open to the latest news articles. The story was picking up traction. Calls from journalists and supporters flooded in. Some people genuinely cared about her cause, others just wanted a front-row seat to the billionaire divorce drama. Linda Carlisle, her attorney, paced in front of her, phone in hand. They're going to hit back. Tony doesn't like bad press. Jean closed her laptop. Good. Linda smirked. You're enjoying this a little, aren't you? Jan gave a small smile. I'm not enjoying it. But after all these years, I'm tired of being the one who compromises. Linda nodded. You've got public sympathy. But let's be clear. This won't be easy. Tony has a legal team that could fight this for years. Jean stood up, walking toward the massive floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Los Angeles skyline. Then we fight for years, she said softly. Linda smiled. I like your style. But both of them knew this was only the beginning. The war had officially escalated. Jean's media campaign had done its job. The public was talking. The headlines painted her as the underdog, the determined philanthropist fighting to keep her legacy alive while her billionaire ex-husband sought to strip it away. But Tony Pritzker wasn't a man who lost battles, especially not in the courtroom. Mark Edelson, Tony's attorney, stood in front of a whiteboard filled with legal strategies, financial diagrams, and trust structures. A team of corporate lawyers sat around the polished oak table, laptops open, analyzing every angle of the case. The press is against you, Mark said. But the law isn't. The trust owns the estate, and Jean is not a beneficiary. That means she has no legal claim to it. Tony leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. Then why is she still fighting? Mark smirked. Because she's playing a different game. She knows she can't win legally. She wants to win in the court of public opinion. She's making this about morality. Tony exhaled. And if I try to force the sale? You'll look like the heartless billionaire kicking out his ex-wife from her charity home. Tony's jaw tightened. She's not staying here. She can go buy another estate with her settlement. Mark nodded. We're going to pressure her in a different way. He slid a file across the table. This is her financial history. Even though she has money, a large part of her philanthropy relies on fundraising and wealthy donors. If we subtly suggest to those donors that her position is unstable, if she loses this case, many will pull their support. Tony's eyes darkened. You're saying we choke her funding? Mark shrugged. She's waging war in the media. We fight where it actually hurts. Tony considered it for a long moment. Then he nodded. Do it. Jean sat at the kitchen island, sipping tea while scrolling through emails. Then she saw it, a notification from one of her largest donors. Dear Jean, due to the uncertainty surrounding the ongoing legal case, we have decided to pause our contributions to foster care counts until further notice. Her grip on the phone tightened. Within the next hour, 3 more similar emails came in. Her stomach turned. She knew exactly what this was. Tony was hitting back. She set the phone down and pressed her fingertips against her temple. Linda, her attorney, walked in just as Jean let out a slow, controlled breath. What's wrong? Linda asked, instantly picking up on the shift in energy. Jean looked up. He's not just fighting me in court, she said. He's cutting off my donors. Linda cursed under her breath. Classic billionaire move, hit where it hurts most. Jean clenched her jaw. Then we hit back. Linda raised an eyebrow. How? Jean's eyes were fierce. We make it personal. The exclusive Los Angeles Philanthropy Gala was one of the city's most elite events. Billionaires, celebrities, and high-profile donors all gathered under the sparkling chandeliers of the Bel Air Country Club. And tonight, Jean made sure every influential person in the room was talking about one thing: Tony Pritzker's greed. Dressed in an elegant yet understated black gown, she moved through the crowd with a quiet but deliberate grace. She didn't have to say much. She simply let the story spread. Tony wants to take the house. Tony doesn't care about Jean's charity. Tony is trying to silence her. The whispers traveled like wildfire. By the time the night was over, Tony's reputation had taken a hit among some of L.A.'s most influential figures. Jean didn't smile. This wasn't over. The battle had stretched on for months. Lawyers fought in courtrooms. PR teams fought in the press. Billionaires whispered in private meetings. But in the end, there could only be one winner. The marble-floored courtroom was packed. Journalists sat along the back row typing furiously on their laptops. In the front, Tony and Jean sat on opposite sides, their legal teams at the ready. Judge Eleanor Graves adjusted her glasses as she looked over the final arguments. She had seen her fair share of high-profile divorces. But this case? This was something else. She cleared her throat and addressed the room. I have reviewed all arguments regarding the ownership of the Pritzker estate. The evidence is clear. The trust, which legally owns the property, does not list Mrs. Pritzker as a beneficiary. Therefore, Mrs. Pritzker has no legal claim to the property. A ripple of reaction passed through the courtroom. Tony sat still, his face unreadable. Jean, however, took a slow breath in. She had expected this ruling, but hearing it out loud felt like a punch to the gut. Judge Graves continued, That said, I strongly encourage the parties to reach a private settlement regarding relocation assistance given Mrs. Pritzker's long-standing residence at the estate. In other words, Jean had lost. But the war wasn't just about the courtroom. After the ruling, Tony and Jen met in a private conference room, just the two of them. No lawyers, no PR teams, just them. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Jean broke the silence. You won, she said. Congratulations. Tony exhaled. This was never about winning, Jean, she scoffed. Don't insult me. It was always about winning for you. Tony leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. I built that house. I protected it. I made sure our kids had a future. This wasn't personal. Jean shook her head. That's where you're wrong. It was always personal. A long silence followed. Then, for the first time in months, Tony's voice softened. I don't want this to be how we end, he admitted. Jean looked at him, searching for sincerity, and for a brief moment, just a flicker, she saw the man she had fallen in love with years ago. But that man was gone. She stood up. I'll find another place for my work. I'll survive. Tony nodded. I know. And just like that, it was over. A few months later, the Pritzker estate hit the market for $195 million. It became one of the most expensive listings in Los Angeles history. Tony moved on, continuing his business empire. Jean relocated to a new estate, smaller but still elegant, where she rebuilt her philanthropy efforts from the ground up. The war had cost them both. But in the end, neither truly won, because some battles don't end with victory. They end with loss. The end.